Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Science Stories from Palomarin. I am Kristen Dybala, Principal Ecologist at Point Blue Conservation Science, and your host for this webinar series. If you haven't already, you should hopefully be seeing a poll question in a pop-up window about whether you've ever been to the Palomarin Field Station. We'd love to know. So we'll just leave that open for a few more seconds as people are trickling in. And whether you visited Palomarin or not, we're so glad you're here today for episode 3 of our webinar series, Habitat and Bird Community Change. It's spring and things are growing and birds are nesting, so it's a great time to talk about habitat change and how that affects our birds. This is going to be a great conversation. We have 3 great scientists lined up to talk with you about vegetation and birds, and especially the role of disturbance on the landscape in creating a mosaic of habitat types for them. So before we dive into that, I want to set the stage a little bit with a little bit of background information. If you are new to Point Blue, welcome. We're so glad you're here. We are a nonprofit science organization, and our mission is to advance the conservation of birds, other wildlife, and ecosystems through science, partnerships, and outreach. And our work is, we're headquartered in Petaluma, but our work stretches from the Sierra Nevada out into the Pacific Ocean and from Alaska to Antarctica. This webinar series is focused on the Palomarin Field Station, located in the Point Reyes National Seashore, just about an hour north of San Francisco. And let me show you the results of our poll. Hopefully you're seeing this. It looks like about a third of you have not visited before, and we're so glad that you are here joining us today. And it looks like about 2/3 of you have visited Palomarin, so that's cool. Palo is very much the heart of Point Blue. It's our original headquarters and has been an active field station year-round for over 50 years. And it's where many of us trained to become the conservation scientists we are today. Palo is normally open to the public for visitors, but for now, of course, we're closed to keep our staff and interns safe. And to help make Palomarin a little bit more accessible to you all, last summer we launched the Palomarin Field Station Data Explorer, which is a series of interactive web pages where you can dive into some of the most important science stories emerging from our long-term research and learn why it's so important that we're able to continue collecting those data. You can find the Data Explorer at pointblue.org/Palo Data Explorer, and we hope you'll visit after today's webinar. So in this webinar series, we're exploring each of those major science stories further in conversation with the scientists and partners who have contributed to them. So today we're focusing on habitat change and how habitat change contributes to change in the bird community. So this is a pair of photos overlooking the Palomarin Field Station and the surrounding study area, showing the change from the 70s to the early 2000s. And you can see the dramatic increase in the number of dug fir trees from the photo on the left to the one on the right. And let's see, I have another poll question for you. Let's see if I can get this going. Oh, that's the wrong question. Here we go. We wondered, what do you all think about habitat change? And it's multiple choice. You can choose multiple answers, I believe. And we're curious about the perspective that you all are bringing here today. And while you're thinking about that, I want to let you know that we are saving some time to answer your questions. So if you're joining us in Zoom, you can submit questions for any of our speakers at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if you run into any technical issues with Zoom, this webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it later. Or you can try joining us on our Facebook live stream, which is also running. And for those of you joining us on our Facebook live stream, we'll also be looking for any questions that come in through the comments there, so feel free to ask away. Okay, looks like responses are still coming in. Well, maybe it's slowing down. We'll give you a couple more seconds to get your votes in. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the polling and share the results. And it looks like the vast majority of you agree that habitat change is affected by management decisions and is a normal part of ecosystem processes. But of course, some mixed results in some of the other options, whether it causes bird population declines or increases, and whether it's destructive to ecosystem processes. So let's see, let me stop this. So it looks like we have a range of perspectives, which is great. And we hope that our conversation today may expand your perspective a little bit and get you thinking about habitat change in a new way. Today, we're digging deeper into the changes in the bird community we've seen as the habitat has changed at Palomarin and in other nearby sites, especially shifts from grassland to coastal scrub to forest. So thanks again for joining, and let's get to it. I'm going to turn it over to Hilary Allen, Point Blue Avian Ecologist and Palomarin Intern Supervisor, who will be interviewing two of the lead scientists who've studied habitat change impacts on birds. So welcome, Hilary.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Christine. And I'm really excited to be here and talk a little bit more about habitat change. It's certainly something that we think a lot about here at the Palomarin Field Station. So to provide a little bit more context for today's topic, I want to first talk about what habitat change is and why it occurs. So habitats are not static systems. And over time, we generally expect that the vegetation in any one place will change slowly and gradually from bare ground to grass, the shrubs, and eventually trees, as the organisms build up the soil and make the environment more suitable for even more plant species to compete with each other for sunlight and nutrients. And this type of change is natural, and it's referred to as habitat succession. And at the same time, this process of succession can be slowed or even reversed by disturbances on the landscape. Fire, flooding, and grazing are all natural means of disturbance that have historically shaped California landscape, helping to maintain a mixture of different successional stages by suppressing the growth of some plant species and promoting the growth of others. So these two processes are constantly balancing each other out. As you can see here in this figure, you're kind of going back and forth between habitat succession in one direction and disturbance in the other. And humans have, of course, shaped habitats as well by introducing new disturbance into systems and suppressing others. And land management is the human practice of controlling disturbance regimes. And lands are managed for all sorts of different reasons, ranging from conservation outcomes to urban development. And fire, mowing, grazing, planting, and restoring are all tools that people can use to manage this balance of succession and disturbance on the landscapes. All right, next slide. So how is this all related to birds, and why is it an important topic for us to be talking about today? So here we have a picture. On the left, we have a wren tit, and wren tits typically prefer shrubby habitats. We have a Wilson's warbler on the right, and Wilson's warblers usually prefer more forested habitats. And so different bird species have different individual habitat requirements and preferences, and these can be affected by habitat change in a number of ways. And certain birds may find it easier or harder to find food or to raise young or avoid predators or survive extreme weather conditions. And by studying how birds within a community respond differently to changes in their environment, we can learn what they each need to thrive. And land management can then benefit from this type of research because it helps us understand how best to create an environment that supports a more resilient. And at Palomarin, we have followed both the habitat succession and the bird community response for over 50 years. So we have a lot of information about this. Here we have a couple of photos of Palomarin again from the 1970s and 2002 on the right, and you can see the differences in the habitat on the study area. So much of the flatland in the Palomarin study area was once cultivated for agricultural use in the years before the field station was established. And since 1965, there has been very little disturbance on the land, and the land has experienced rapid habitat succession. So the open fields that you see on this top photo on the right, those were open fields that were once used for agriculture in the late 50s. And now you can see on that bottom right photo, the Doug fir forest is really starting to mature on that same plot of land. And we began collecting vegetation data in the 80s to capture this change in the plant structure and the species composition. And our vegetation data set includes information on the height, the density, and the species of plants on our study plot. And we have a graph here on the left side. It's a graph showing the average height of Doug firs at Palomarin steadily increasing over time. And while this data that it is presenting is a very simple concept, trees are getting larger over time, it's really valuable for us to be able to more precisely describe the rate and the magnitude of this change so that we can more easily compare it to other changes that we're seeing here at Palomarin. And Point Blue biologists began studying the birds at the Palomarin study site in 1966. And in 1979, we began our breeding biology program, which is a long-term study of the reproductive success, the individual fitness, and the territory density of the land birds at Palomarin, with a focus on the local populations of some of our more abundant species, which we refer to as our study or focal species. And this graph here, you'll see 4 of our focal species: the wren-tit, the song sparrow, the white-crowned sparrow, and the Wilson's warblers. And this graph shows the number of territories at the Palo study site for those 4 species from 1982 to 2018. And you'll notice that the number of song sparrows and white-crowned sparrow territories have declined during this time period. So that's the light blue line, and the green lines. And you'll see that the Wilson's warbler, the orange line, has increased over this time period. And the song sparrow and white-crowned sparrow are 2 species commonly found in scrub, whereas the Wilson's warblers are more associated with forest. And this graph here is a very good example of the type of change that has happened to the bird community at Palo as the vegetation has changed over time as well. And more broadly speaking, what we've seen is this strong response of the bird community to the habitat succession at Palomarin, with fewer scrub species and more forest species now present on the landscape. Okay, great. So we have 2 guest speakers today, and they've both spent extensive time at Palomarin and have used the field station's long-term data for their graduate work. And they're both also interested in researching habitat change and succession and its effect on bird communities. So our first guest is Libby Porzig, and Libby is the Working Lands Director at Point Blue, where she leads work studying ecological function on rangelands throughout California. And she was previously a Palo intern, and she also completed her PhD dissertation work using Palomarin's long-term data set. So today I'll be talking with her and asking her a few questions about her dissertation work on white-crowned sparrows at Palomarin. And she looked at both the white-crowned sparrow nesting data and the veg data at Palo, and she found that between 1981 and 2010, as the vegetation at the Palomarin Field Station changed from shrubs to dense conifers, the number of nesting white-crowned sparrows at the study site declined by 85%. But despite this population decline, the reproductive success of the white-crowned sparrow nests remained constant. And you can see in this figure that the white-crowned sparrows really tracked the habitat over time, and they continued to nest only in areas where there was earlier successional scrub, even as the forest grew up around them. So that's kind of showing that they could track that habitat change. So welcome, Libby. I'm glad that you're here today and we can talk with you a little bit more about this interesting work.
Thanks, Hilary. It is great to be here. It's great to see you, and bravo to you and the Palo team for putting together this webinar series. I think it's totally cool, and in a time when we can't all be at Palo perhaps as much as we like, that we can still get to engage with the data and share some of the stories about what you all are up to out there.
Awesome, yeah, and talk a little bit more about white-crowned sparrows. One of our favorites. Awesome. So you were an intern at Palo, as I mentioned, and you did that before you started grad school. Did you already know that you wanted to study long-term habitat change before you started your grad work, or how did you decide to focus on this work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I think, well, probably like many graduate students. I started my graduate work in ecology interested in a pretty broad range of topics. One of the things I was especially interested in is this intersection between behavioral ecology and population dynamics. Or in other words, I was really interested in the ways in which animals perceive and respond to their environment, and particularly how those behaviors then influence the distribution and abundance of biodiversity on the landscape scale. And so, Palo is a really great place to study that because there is a wealth of data, both at the sort of population and the community scale, but also at the behavioral scale. We understand at Palo, we understand birds as individuals. We track them through the course of their life. We know what decisions they're making about, where to build a nest and who to mate with, and we understand the sort of fitness outcomes of those decisions. So that was the kind of broad interest or context that I kind of came to my graduate work in. And really, the habitat changes, the successional changes at Palo really are, to me, I just saw it as one of the dominant or the sort of very important narratives or contributions that Palo has to the field of ecology, because it's not often that we have an opportunity to study birds from the scale of individuals all the way up to the community over such long periods of time, and in a situation where there really is such dramatic habitat change. I mean, the successional changes at Palo, as you and Christy explained, are as a result of lack of disturbance since the land had been sort of settled and farmed through the mid 20th century. But I also felt that we could sort of use that as an analog for understanding how birds and how wildlife responds to changes, could respond to changes from climate or changes from other kinds of changes in disturbance patterns, both within California and also more broadly.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that having been an intern myself and being out on the landscape, and it is such an interesting thing to kind of pair that individual data points with like that overall time scale. That's awesome that you were able to do that. Okay, so the second question, we've seen this dramatic decline in the white-crowned sparrow population as the habitat has changed. And were you surprised that there was no real change in the reproductive success at the same time? And what do you think that tells us about conservation for declining species?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I think, was I surprised to see that result? I don't think I was necessarily surprised. I think that, there has been a good wealth of theoretical and also empirical work on the subject. And that certainly is, I think one of the outcomes that certainly makes sense. I mean, and in my mind, essentially what that, how I interpreted that was that essentially, the birds were able to, to cue into and to respond to the ways in which the habitat is changing in suitability for them. So they were essentially able to adjust their nesting densities such that for the individuals who do remain at Palomarin and are breeding there, that they are essentially afforded the sort of same chances, same sort of fitness probability, at least from the perspective of reproductive success, as they were when the habitat was more suitable. So I wouldn't say it was necessarily a particularly surprising result. I think that in terms of what the sort of implications or the consequences might be for conservation of declining species, I think that one of them is that I think that it is important, particularly in a situation where a species is in decline. I think it's important not just for us to have the ability to not just study the sort of overall numbers, the sort of trends in their population numbers, but also to have the opportunity to understand and to study their vital rates. So things like reproduction and survival and movement, because that really does paint a sort of much more complete picture of the ways in which the population change is sort of being driven by these individual demographic drivers, and that can then help inform. They can absolutely help inform conservation strategies.
Yeah, it also kind of highlights, I think, the importance of just natural history observations and kind of knowing what species need more generally. So, yeah. Okay, so our last question. You now lead the Working Lands program at Point Blue, which includes research on rangeland management throughout California. And the question here is, has your research experience at Palomarin influenced your current work?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, so definitely my experience at Palomarin, it's had a really big impact on my life and my career overall. I think when I think about how Palomarin specifically has influenced the work that I do now, I think one of the gifts that Palo has given me and I think many others is the opportunity to really spend time thinking about ecology and thinking about ecosystems and ecosystem processes on pretty long time scales. And that's a really great thing. And I think that it's helped me think about habitats and think about ecosystems, not just like as a sort of particular state in time, but as a sort of point along a trajectory. And I think that is important in thinking about many sort of similar ecosystems that we see across California, some of which are, public lands that are natural and wild lands, but also, lands that are, in food production and, things like rangelands and things like other agricultural landscapes. And so it's really helped me sort of think about these landscapes as sort of habitat value of these landscapes as sort of points along a trajectory. And that then I think is valuable and informative for them thinking about how, management and stewardship actions can maximize the value of these landscapes for biodiversity at large. I think another thing that, so the story of Palo is this sort of story of secondary succession in a lot of ways. And I think that, from this, we understand that from a bird perspective, there are some birds that have, as you showed in that earlier graph, there are some birds that have benefited from this, and then there are some birds, at least locally at Palomarin, that have declined as a result of this. And I think that, to me, it's not to say that that's, like inherently a good or a bad thing, but I think it points to the value of having a heterogeneous mosaic of these habitats across the landscape. That essentially, if we want to think about the sort of broader landscape and whether that landscape is, the sort of coastal Marin County or the central coast of California or California at large, we want to think about what are the ways in which, human action, our actions are influencing the degree to which these landscapes exist in a mosaic.
Great. Yeah, kind of also going back to like that balance of the habitat succession and also the disturbance, and just kind of needing that, humans can help kind of continue that balance so that we have multiple habitats for everyone who needs them. So great.
Yeah, that's
awesome. Well, thank you so much, Libby.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thanks everyone for being here.
Thinking a little bit as well. So we'll see you soon.
All right.
Okay, so our next guest speaker is Ryan DiGaudio, and Ryan is an ecologist at Point Blue. His work focuses on understanding how birds respond to changes related to land management and restoration, and he is especially interested in grassland systems and grassland birds. His master's thesis used Palo's long-term data set to investigate the migration timing of songbirds and how it might be impacted by climate change. But today we will be talking with Ryan about a grassland ecology project that he worked on at Jenner Headlands, which is in Sonoma County. And so similar to the information that we collect at Palo, Ryan led work collecting data on the vegetation structure community at Jenner Headlands and on an adjacent property, the Sonoma Coast State Park. Both of these properties have large sections of coastal prairie grasslands, though Jenner Headlands had been grazed for over 120 years and Sonoma Coast State Park had been ungrazed. And he looked at the overall bird and plant community composition and the presence or absence of grassland focal bird species at both sites to compare the possible effects of land management on the grassland ecosystem. And so he found that the grazed Jenner Headland site had overall higher indices of bird species richness, species diversity, and relative abundance. And it supported 10 grassland focal species that were not found at Sonoma Coast State Park. So that's pretty impressive. Many grasslands on the California coast have been experiencing a successive transition to coastal scrub, leaving fewer and fewer intact patches of grassland. And prior to Point Blue's work at Palomarin, the Palo study site may have once been a coastal prairie grassland. So this type of change that we're witnessing here at Palo today, from the scrub to the forest, is likely not the first transition that the landscape here at Palo has experienced. And so here we have a picture of a grasshopper sparrow, which is a grassland focal species. And let's talk with Ryan a little bit more about grasslands. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you, Hilary. It's good to be here.
Awesome. So we're just going to dive into our first question. So you also did your graduate research at using Palomarin data, as I said, and you started out as a Point Blue intern. And since then, you've also worked on a wide range of Point Blue projects. So my question here is then grassland birds.
You cut out there for a moment,
Uh-oh.
but I believe your question was what led to my interest in grassland birds?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, well, my interests are quite varied, with regards to birds. But I feel like grassland birds as a group, they have not received the attention they deserved in terms of understanding their community and populations and their conservation. When I started out in bird conservation and field research, much of our emphasis was on riparian birds and riparian habitats. And this is particularly true of birds in the West. Riparian habitat had been identified as the most important habitat to conserve for land birds in the Western United States. But in about the past 10 years, we've come to realize that grassland birds were just falling off the map. They've been identified as they're experiencing widespread population declines. In fact, their populations are declining faster now than any other group of birds. And so they need our love. So that's one reason why I'm interested in grassland birds now. So in response, we've been putting a lot of energy into studying grassland birds in recent years and developing conservation recommendations that we can pass on to land managers and other conservation partners. For example, recently we worked with the Central Valley Joint Venture to develop conservation objectives for grassland birds and oak savanna birds of the open country, for the Central Valley and the surrounding foothills. And we've also been working on updating the California Partners in Flight Grassland Bird Conservation Plan. But lastly, I think that grassland birds are just super cool. They, unlike other birds that are hiding in the bushes, like wren tits and white-crowned sparrows, which, bless their hearts, they're great. Grassland birds, they're just out there in the open. The only cover they have is the grass over their nest, and they nest right on the ground. Many of them build these really cool cup nests where they put a dome of grass over the top, like a little grass igloo. So if you spend time out there, you just come to love them. The Western Meadowlark song is one of the most beautiful bird songs I can think of, and grasshopper sparrows, they're just characters. Just love them.
Yeah, they definitely are. I had actually my first grasshopper sparrow yesterday. So that was pretty exciting to hear the first one of the year back again. Great, so your research in the Jenner Headlands, it compared grazed and ungrazed plots. And I think that some people may be surprised that the grassland birds did better grazed plots than they did on the ungrazed plots. And why do you think that was? And how do you explain this to people who might be concerned about overgrazing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I get that question a lot, and it's understandable. But this all kind of gets back to what we've been talking about: habitat succession and the role of of disturbance and keeping habitat succession in check. And for grasslands, especially coastal grasslands, these are not static habitats. They want to become coastal scrub. And in some cases, like at Palo, it can become a dug fir forest. And so in the absence of any kind of ecological disturbance, and grazing is just one form of a disturbance process, grasslands oftentimes cease to become grasslands. And what we saw at the Jenner Headlands project as an example, and that ungrazed state park that was adjacent to the Headlands property, the ungrazed grassland, it was not looking very much like a grassland at the time that we surveyed those sites. It was quickly becoming coastal scrub, in my opinion. And so there just wasn't a lot of quality grassland habitat for these grassland birds.
I think that that's also something interesting that I think about often, like, you know, a grassland, you think of, there's not very much vegetation. So it's like, I feel like some people may think more vegetation equals more birds equals maybe a better habitat. So yeah, really like the importance of grassland species, especially, and like, you know, they're also unique to their own habitats. So it's an interesting thing to think about. Okay, so talking a little bit more about disturbance, more generally, what do you think is the role of disturbance on the landscape for bird conservation specifically, and whether that's from grazing or fire or erosion? What happens without disturbance, and what happens with too much disturbance as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think you need to think about what would this habitat, what would this landscape look like in the absence of disturbance? Is it undergoing habitat change? And you only know that if you have some baseline data or some point of reference in the past to look back on. And the other aspect to think about is, what do you want to have here on the landscape? What are you trying to manage for? And I think, the best that we could do is just strive for an ecological balance, strive for maintaining healthy, thriving natural communities. And one way to do that is to maintain a heterogeneous mosaic, habitat mosaic on the landscape. So, yeah. I don't want to say one habitat is better than another habitat, because on the one hand, if a grassland becomes coastal scrub, that's great for the wren tits and the white-crowned sparrows and the song sparrows, but it's not good for the grasshopper sparrows, which I should mention is a California bird species of special concern. So we should be, looking out for the grasshopper sparrows and other bird species of conservation concern.
Yeah, it seems really like, with disturbance and with succession, it's just about that balance and kind of making sure that you don't do too much of either, like letting it get too much of our land become forest, or, have too much disturbance that it's all just kind of at the same successional stage. So, well, great. Thank you so much, Ryan. Thanks for talking a little bit more about grasslands. They're awesome. Everyone should go sit in a grassland for a while, listen for the grasshopper sparrows for sure. Great. So I think that, yeah, we'll come back to you with some questions in a little bit as well.
Good. Thanks, Hilary.
Okay. So it's time for questions. Christy, I think that I'm going to give it back to you at this point.
Sounds good. Thanks, Hilary. And thank you so much to Hilary, Libby, and Ryan for such a great conversation. We have saved some time to answer audience questions, so feel free to submit your question using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We have a bunch coming in already. You can also, if you're on Facebook, you can add questions to the comments there, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. Before we dig into those, I wanted to just remind you to please check out the Palomarin Field Station Data Explorer if you haven't yet. This is our interactive website that lets you dive into our decades of data, including some of the figures you saw here today. And to make sure you hear about future webinars in this series and other Point Blue events, you can sign up for our email list. And you can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We do also have a live bird banding demonstration planned for next Wednesday in the morning, and you can find that on Facebook as well. We are also a nonprofit science organization that relies on donations to support our conservation research, our intern training, and our public outreach efforts like this one. So if you enjoyed this webinar or enjoyed hearing about this kind of research and would like to support our conservation efforts, please consider giving us a donation at pointblue.org/donate. We have some donors attending today who've been supporting Palomarin and Point Blue for decades. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your support. Okay, I'm going to invite all of our speakers back on screen here and start with some of these questions. There you are. Okay. And let me stop this. Okay. Okay, so our first question, let me start with kind of a more general question, going back to some of the introduction material that Hilary presented with the figures of how the birds have responded at Palomarin over time. And some astute viewers have noticed that the wren tits have not been declining, even though they are scrub-associated species. And so I know several of you have probably a lot to say about that, but I'll ask Hilary to respond to that first.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so that has been a really interesting thing, and it's something that we talk a lot about at Palo, and we still don't fully understand, why it is that they have done so well when they're supposed to be, pretty closely associated with scrub. And as the scrub has just gone away, their numbers have mostly actually increased over time. And so we now have wren tits that are nesting and living in a dense Doug fir forest. So that has been super interesting for us to watch that progression. And so one of the things that we think may be contributing to their population just staying stable or even continuing to increase over time is that they do not move very far. So with some of our other scrub species, such as the white-crowned sparrow and the song sparrow, if they don't have very good habitat in a certain place, they can fly away and find it somewhere else. Whereas the wren tits don't really move. They're not very good at flying, and they just don't move very far. Often a young wren tit will set up a territory right next to where its parents are. So they just are used to, staying in a pretty small space for their entire life. And so it seems that maybe what has happened is that they have just kind of adapted to this, to the habitat that is here now, and that they perhaps prefer scrub, but that they do just fine in the forest. And since, they would rather adapt to this changing environment than try to move far away to find better habitat for them. So they're just continuing to do quite well in this landscape.
Great, thanks. Does anybody have anything to add to that? Doesn't look like it. Oh, Olivia's muted.
Thanks. I'll just add, Hilary, I think you did a really great job with your remarks there, and I'll just sort of put a point of emphasis. I think that this topic, that the sort of wren tit story in particular, is a really interesting one with Palo, and I think would be a really great topic area to for someone to take on with some more in-depth look at the data, because that really is a super rich data set there.
Yeah, for sure. Tons more to study at Palo, always. Okay, this next question is maybe more generally applicable to Palo, but also the Jenner Headlands study and maybe grasslands more generally in California. And there's several questions along the lines of, wondering about natural fire return intervals and specifically the role of Native Americans in maintaining these landscapes. And I wonder if any of you have some insights to share.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no expert in in how in the Native Americans using fire per se, although I know that they did use fire, and it's well understood that Native Americans used fire throughout North America, but also in California and in coastal grasslands to maintain grasslands as grasslands, to keep them open both for accessing game that they were interested in, but also for maintaining plants that were of cultural importance, whether it's for food or basketry or other uses. So fire was an important factor on the landscape before European colonization.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I don't know if we know much about the history of fire at the Palomarin location in particular, but we do know that it was certainly used, an area that was used by indigenous peoples, and certainly, had been for many, many years prior to it becoming a national park and prior to the establishment of the field station. So definitely an area that would be interesting to learn more about. And I think there's several kind of related questions about reintroducing fire to the landscape, and particularly at Palo, and wondering more generally, what's the role of prescribed burns in maintaining grasslands, and have we ever considered that for Palomarin, and are we allowed to?
Yeah, so it's something that we definitely have thought about at Palo, and I think that it used to be something a little bit that was probably discussed a little bit more than it is these days, because we are pretty in full forest mode at this point. But it would be really interesting to see at this point, what happens to the community if we go back to those earlier successional stages. But at this point, there isn't really any, there are no plans to do that to the Palomarin site.
Yeah, it is national park land, and we don't control what happens there. But there have been discussions in the past with considering that and what it would mean for the landscape, but also for our long-term data sets, and whether that would whether that's a good decision or not, I think is always up for debate. Certainly would change the landscape, but it is interesting to think about what it would mean for some of our different species. Yeah, Libby.
Yeah, I think, well, I'll add, if it is something that the park does decide to do, to introduce some more controlled burning to the landscape, I mean, there certainly is, there's a wealth of there's many, many decades of baseline data. So the opportunity to then sort of, study what happens to the bird community post-fire certainly would be sort of informed by the pre-fire condition in a way that, may be unparalleled for, certainly for this ecosystem type, but, maybe anywhere globally.
Yeah. And somebody mentioned in the Q&A just that it could also be just removing furs. It wouldn't necessarily have to be fire. There are a number of different kinds of disturbance we've already talked about today with grazing, and I think Hilary also mentioned mowing, and fire is just one of them. Okay, so let's see. I guess let me ask Ryan for a little bit more details about his study. Someone is wondering if you can talk more about which grassland species, which other grassland species you studied, and where else have you studied effects of grazing or other kinds of disturbance on ecosystems and bird communities?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the short answer to which grassland species I studied, it's the ones that are there, and the ones that are there are, let's see. Near the coast, it's grasshopper sparrow, savanna sparrow, sometimes western meadowlark, horned lark, lark sparrow. Am I forgetting any? But those are the main species. And then there are some that are kind of ecotone species, like the oak savanna species, like western bluebird is an example. And where else have we looked at grassland birds besides Jenner headlands? Well, let's see. Recently, we did grassland bird surveys in around, it's called the One Tam area, which is many different jurisdictions, but included Golden Gate National Recreation Area, in the Point Reyes area, and Mount Tamalpais State Park, and several Marin County Park parcels that have grassland habitat, and also Marin Municipal Water District lands with grasslands are some examples. In fact, the slide that Hilary put up that showed the grazed versus ungrazed with the grasshopper sparrow photo in the middle earlier, those were photos taking on Golden Gate National Recreation Area lands in Olima Valley. And those two sites are very close together. It's just one site happened to be grazed and one site was, I'm assuming, previously grazed, but hadn't been grazed in recent years.
Great, thanks. And kind of a follow-up question maybe for both you and Libby is, what do we know about, or what studies have we done about which grazing methods are better or worse for creating good habitat for grassland birds?
Well, I'll start off and just say that that is a really, really good question. And we are trying to answer that question, but it is tough because grazing practices, it's so all over the map with different beef producers and people who operate cattle on the lands. And so we're looking at things like grazing timing, duration, intensity, and it just varies so much from place to place. And where one practice might be good, doesn't work at another location, or what's good at one place might not be good the following year because of a different amount of rainfall or some other factors. And so there's a lot of confounding variables, and it's tricky, but we've been collecting a lot of data for the past 5 years or so in the Working Lands program with a lot of different ranches around California. So we're hoping to have some answers soon.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I think that, so just like, birds have these habitat preferences on these kind of broad scales, when we sort of compare, kind of grassland to shrubland to conifer. Also, even within grassland species, they're not all grassland birds are, sort of have the same type of preference. And so it really, so in terms of, if we want to, now in thinking about the question, like what is the best grazing system or the best kind of grazing strategy for grassland birds, it is going to vary a bit by species, and as Ryan said, it isn't going to be one size fits all. And so we definitely advocate in the in agroecological landscapes and in managed landscapes to take the adaptive management approach, where it's important to sort of take stock of what your wildlife populations are and to kind of monitor them in an ongoing way so that you can understand what those impacts are to individual species. But generally things like recommendations like maintaining a habitat mosaic is going to hit a lot of is going to do well for a lot of your grassland species, and a lot of these, as Ryan mentioned, these other kinds of kind of ecotone or early successional species. And then also, even things like, potentially decreasing stocking rates or avoiding nesting or avoiding grazing, like in the sort of highest nesting density areas, like during the breeding season, is another, kind of common recommendation. And that can be something that can sort of, fit across a broad variety of grazing systems or grazing management strategies.
For sure. Okay, thanks for that. I kind of want to change gears a little bit. Getting back to this idea about animal behavior and sort of response to habitat change. And there's a couple of related questions about more about wren tits, but also white-crowned sparrows. Curiosity about what are some of the limiting factors for white-crowned sparrow breeding? Is it food or nest sites or something else? And similarly with wren tits, how are they changing their behavior? Are they nesting in using different nest materials when they're nesting in the forest? Are they changing what they're eating? Do we know anything about that? And how their reproductive success varies maybe in the forest?
So the first part of that question about white-crowned sparrows. So at Palo, they're pretty associated with the California sage. And I don't know exactly why they have such a strong preference. I think that's a little bit of a difficult thing for us to know exactly, but their behavior for nest site selection in those areas, it's a little bit hard to know exactly what it is for and why they're so, they do not want to be in the forest. In terms of what has happened with the wren tits, that is actually something difficult for us to answer. Also, the behavior differences or the nest success in the forest over the scrub, because the forest wren tits are a little bit more difficult for us to track. And so we don't fully know how different their behavior is, and with things like nest site selection or what type of food they're eating, or other behaviors that they're engaging in. We don't know exactly. We have some ideas, but we can't track it quite as well to determine the differences between scrub and forest wren tits.
Sounds like a good research question.
For sure. And yeah, it is something, since the way that we're tracking these birds, we're following individuals and writing down all of these different observations that we have. So it is something that a lot of these questions, it can be a little bit difficult to have data to really answer some of these hard questions, but we definitely have thoughts about what's going on because we're following those birds and thinking about it every day. So.
And Libby, any thoughts on what the limiting factors were for the white-crowned sparrows as the habitat changed?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think I don't have any, I think, really awesome insight here, to be honest. I think, they're not going to be nest site limited, necessarily, because white-crowned sparrows, while they do like a sort of open grassland or early successional scrub habitat, they nest in scrub. I think that, some of the things that I think about are, certainly the changes in food availability. They do eat a mixed diet, but seeds or grass seeds are an important part of their diet. So that certainly could be it. I think that this is maybe one of the areas or one of the topic areas where there's an opportunity to pair, potentially a sort of additional research kind of experiment, with some of the sort of ongoing data that are collected at Palo to try to get at some of that. And then, of course, I think another thing that we've often talked about too is the degree to which changes in, so it's not just the birds, the sort of focal species birds that are changing as response to changes in habitat, but also their predators as well. And so whether or not the changes in habitat, would make white-crowned sparrows sort of more vulnerable to or more responsive to any kind of changes in the predator community, I think is another one that should be considered too.
Yeah, that's a great point. It seems like no matter how much we study, how much data we collect at Palomarin, there's always more. There's always more we wish we had. And that's why it's so great to have grad students who can, or other researchers partner with us and kind of build on that incredible kind of baseline of data that's there and kind of add some more layers to it. Well, cool. I want to just end with one more question about climate change. And what are your thoughts on how climate change is affecting the pace of habitat succession, or maybe, just the frequency of disturbance, or how climate change is sort of interacting with these processes and what implications that might have for birds and other wildlife?
Yeah, I think the climate change question is a really good one. I don't know actually, and Ryan or Chris or Hilary, anyone of you guys might know this better than me, but I'm wondering if if David Ackerley is in our guest, is in and among our guests, who's done, I believe, a fair amount of thinking about how climate change is going to be affecting vegetation communities across California, across the area in the future. I think that, certainly I think that this is where the climate change impacts get really interesting. Well, I mean, one of the places where they get really interesting is where they intersect with, with some of these more, localized management, management legacies and management dynamics. So maybe I'll just kind of leave that there and pass it back to you, Christy, or Hilary, or Ryan, to either one of you.
Yeah, Ryan, did you have something to add?
Well, I mean, climate change can affect habitat change in so many ways, I can imagine. And one thing that came to mind were just the crazy number of wildfires we had in California and in the West last year, and how that is, we can never make a direct link between one, extreme heat wave followed by an anomalous lightning storm and link that with climate change, but it seems like that is a result of climate change, and the fires that resulted were a result of climate change. And so that's just one example I can think of, is to have more stochastic events on the landscape, such as these high intensity fires. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, we know climate change is expected to increase the frequency of these extreme events, and so fires for sure. Big floods could also be a factor in some places, and kind of the effect of erosion and those sorts of things. And then just changes in heat. What does that mean for grasslands or for forests? And I guess the flip side of floods is extreme drought, which certainly will kill trees and kill certain kinds of vegetation. So it's complicated, I think, is the answer. It depends so much on where you are, like so many things. Okay, well, we'll leave it there. I want to just thank you all again so much for participating in this panel discussion, and thanks so much to all of our great audience members for all of their participation and their great questions. We didn't get to them all, but let's see here. I have just one more slide to kind of wrap things up with. Let me share this again. And that is not it. There we go. Okay. So yeah, we are just about out of time, but thanks to all of you. And if you do have any more questions and we didn't get to your question, didn't answer it fully, you're welcome to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. Our contact info for Hilary and I is up here on the slide. And before we go, I just wanted to kind of try to wrap this up with some key take-home messages for how habitat change affects birds. And what we've talked about today is that habitat change is constantly happening, whether through disturbances like fire or grazing, or decisions to prevent those disturbances, which allow the slow conversion of grassland to scrub to forest. And through our research, we know that birds track these changes very closely. So decisions we make about landscape management, including decisions to prevent disturbances, are choices that will benefit one set of species over another, like favoring forest species over grassland species. And at any individual place, that's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. We like forest species too, but it can be a problem for bird conservation when those decisions are repeated consistently across the broader landscape, so that we keep losing grasslands and grassland birds. So, it's important to take in a long-term and landscape view and think about how your area contributes to a diverse mosaic of habitat types on the broader landscape. And think about how that mosaic is changing over time. Thanks so much for joining us. I will say you can help improve that diversity by supporting conservation and restoration efforts that seek to reestablish and expand habitat types that are less common than they used to be. Just thanks so much for your interest in this webinar series and for tuning in today. The 4th episode coming up will focus on migration and what we've learned about where our birds go. So be sure to sign up at pointblue.org/migration. sign-up so you don't miss it. Have a great afternoon. Great afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us.